Welcome to Nero's Secrets. I'm your host, Jimmy. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more mystery stories. Let's get started. Chapter 1, Reflections in Smoke. I'm not saying New York is a city full of crazy people, but if you offered a psychiatrist a free tour of Manhattan, he'd need a notebook the size of the Empire State Building. I've seen just about every variety. Nervous wrecks, harmless cranks, and the occasional bona fide lunatic. Still, even I blinked when the man with the mirror showed up at the brownstone. It was a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind that paints the whole city the colour of wet newspaper. Wolfe had just finished breakfast. Poached eggs, hothouse tomatoes, and enough grumbling about Fritz's choice of paprika to fill a small novel. I was sorting the morning mail, dreaming about a second cup of coffee, when the doorbell rang. Fritz answered, and a minute later he stuck his head into the office, his expression politely appalled. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "there is a man here who insists he must see Mr. Wolfe immediately." I looked over at Wolfe. He grunted without looking up from his newspaper. "Describe him," Wolfe said. Fritz hesitated. "He is carrying a mirror." Wolfe folded the paper with exaggerated care and gave me a look reserved for household catastrophes and unexpected clients. "Show him in," he said with a sigh. "Mr. Goodwin will intercept him." I got to the door in time to see our guest standing there, clutching a mirror no bigger than a paperback book. He was thin, pale and twitchy in a way that suggested he either drank too much coffee or not enough bourbon. His suit was dark and wrinkled. His hair looked like it had lost a fight with a ceiling fan. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, wide-eyed. "Inside," I said, steering him toward the red leather chair. "And mind the furniture. Mirrors are bad luck enough without breaking one in here." He sat gingerly, clutching the mirror against his chest like a lifeline. Wolfe eyed him as if debating whether the man's madness would be contagious. "Your name?" Wolfe demanded. "Gilbert Sloane," he said, voice thin and wavering. I need help, Mr. Wolfe. I'm being followed." "Congratulations," I said dryly. "You're in good company. Half the city thinks they're being tailed. Some of them even are." Sloane shook his head violently. "No, you don't understand. I see them. In mirrors. Only in mirrors." Wolfe leaned back and steepled his fingers. "You are not merely being followed," he said. "You are being haunted." Sloane swallowed hard. "It sounds crazy. I know it does, but it's real. I see faces, reflections that don't match reality. People behind me, watching, always watching." "And these reflections," Wolfe said, voice silky and skeptical, "do they speak to you?" Sloane flinched. "No, they vanish if I turn around. But lately they've been getting clearer. Closer." I shot Wolfe a sidelong glance. Usually we get clients with concrete problems. Missing wills, poisoned chocolates, corpses in library closets. This was one for the books. Still, Wolfe's eyes had narrowed the way they do when a puzzle, however cracked, presents some glint of genuine curiosity. "You have another reason," Wolfe said, "to believe you are in danger." Sloane nodded miserably. "This morning, someone broke into my apartment. Nothing was stolen, nothing touched except—" He held up the mirror, hands trembling. It was moving, turned to face my bed. Wolfe sat very still. "You believe," he said slowly, That someone is using the mirrors to frighten you. Or worse. Yes, Sloane whispered. And I'm afraid I'm not imagining it. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, like a man weighing a decision he already hated. Mr. Goodwin, he said without opening them, you will accompany Mr. Sloane back to his residence. You will observe and report. I nodded, slipping my notebook into my pocket. And you, Mr. Sloane, Wolfe said, will provide Mr. Goodwin with full access. Every mirror, every room, every shadow. Sloane nodded frantically, clutching the mirror tighter. Wolfe's voice dropped another octave, as rich and dark as the rain still hammering the city outside. Someone, Mr. Sloane, wishes you to fear your own reflection. I intend to find out why. I herded Sloane out the door. I caught a glimpse of the mirror's surface. Just for a second. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was my imagination. Or maybe, just maybe, something flickered there. Something cold and watching. Either way, I shivered once and decided, whatever Sloane was seeing, it wasn't just his nerves. It was something real. And it had just stepped into our world, whether we liked it or not. Chapter 2. Cracks in the glass Gilbert Sloane's apartment was on the top floor of a worn but respectable brownstone in Murray Hill. One of those places where the rent stayed high because of nostalgia rather than any particular charm. We climbed 4 flights of stairs with Sloane darting nervous glances over his shoulder every few steps, cradling the mirror like it might jump out of his hands and bite him. At the door, he fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I almost offered to do it myself. The lock clicked open, and he ushered me inside with all the ceremony of a man leading someone into a condemned building. The place smelled faintly of dust and cold coffee. The furnishings were sparse. An old sofa, a scuffed oak table, a few battered bookcases sagging under the weight of paperbacks and yellowed newspapers, and mirrors everywhere. Above the fireplace, opposite the windows, framed and unframed, large and small. Some new, some ancient enough to have seen more than Sloane's jittery reflection over the years. I whistled low under my breath. "Ding, to start a carnival funhouse?" I asked. He flinched like I'd slapped him. "They keep me safe," he muttered. "Or at least they did." I didn't argue. I had my doubts about mirrors providing much in the way of safety. But considering the look in his eyes, arguing psychology wasn't on the menu. Instead, I circled the room, taking it all in. The mirrors were spotless, not a speck of dust or smudge on any surface. Sloane might have been unravelling, but he took damn good care of his glass. "Show me the one that was moved," I said. He led me into the bedroom, a narrow little space with a single bed, a battered dresser, and 2 mirrors, one freestanding against the far wall, and the other, the one he clutched, usually perched atop. "The dresser. I always leave it facing the window," he said, voice low. "Always. Last night, this morning, it was facing the bed." I examined the dresser. No obvious signs of disturbance, no prints either, but the surface was polished to such a shine, a ghost could have slid across it without leaving a trace. I checked. The door and windows next. Nothing broken, no forced entry. "So, how would they get in?" I asked. Sloane shook his head miserably. "I don't know. I lock everything, always. Superintendent?" He shook his head harder. No one has a key. I change the locks myself every 6 months. I believed him. Paranoia tends to make you thorough. I spent the next half hour combing the apartment. No hidden panels, no loose floorboards, no sign anyone had tampered with the door or windows. Either Sloane had a stalker with Houdini's resume, or he had a problem no locksmith could fix. When I finished, I found him standing by the window, staring out at the grey, dripping city. "They're coming closer," he said without turning. "I can feel it." "You live alone?" I asked. "Yes, no family, no close friends." "And enemies?" His shoulders hunched. "Not that I know of." I nodded slowly, tapping my pen against my notebook. Strange phone calls, threats, people hanging around the building. He hesitated. "There was one thing," he said. "2 weeks ago, a man. I caught him watching the building from across the street." "What did he look like?" "I don't know. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he was wearing a dark overcoat, a hat pulled low." "Typical," I muttered. "What happened?" I looked away, just for a second. When I looked back, he was gone. I closed my notebook. "All right," I said. "Listen, for now, you don't leave the apartment without telling me first. And don't touch the mirrors unless you have to." He nodded, clutching the small mirror tighter. I left him there, standing stiffly at the window like a man waiting for a ship that wasn't going to dock. On the street, I lit a cigarette and leaned against a lamppost, thinking, no forced entry, no signs of tampering. But someone had been inside that apartment. Someone who knew Sloane's mind well enough to know a simple movement, a shift of a mirror, would shatter his nerves worse than any broken window ever could. Wolfe wasn't going to like it. Cases with no footprints to follow gave him indigestion. But my gut said Sloane wasn't crazy. Not entirely. Someone was messing with him. The only question was whether they wanted him scared, or whether they wanted him broken, and if they kept pushing. There wasn't going to be a mirror left in the world big enough to save him. Chapter 3. A face without a reflection. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was finishing his lunch, methodically working his way through a plate of squab stuffed with wild rice and some particularly smug-looking glazed carrots. Fritz hovered nearby like a mother hen, ready to whisk away the dish the second Wolfe so much as frowned at it. I waited until the last forkful was polished off before stepping into the office. Wolfe leaned back in his chair and regarded me through half-closed eyes. "Mr. Sloane," he said. "Alive for now," I said. "Paranoid, definitely, but not stupid. Somebody's spooking him good, and they're careful." I gave him the full rundown. The moved mirror, the absence of forced entry, the shadows Sloane swore he saw in the glass, and the mysterious figure across the street who'd pulled a vanishing act. Wolfe listened without interruption, only lifting a hand once to signal Fritz for a fresh beer. When I finished, he let out a heavy sigh. "A man who fears mirrors," he mused. "It is rare for delusion to be so specific." "Unless," I said, "it's not a delusion." He cocked an eyebrow. "No footprints, no break-in," I continued. "But somebody was there. Somebody smart enough to rattle Sloane without leaving evidence. A psychological assault," Wolfe murmured. "Calculated, intimate." "Right," I said, "which means whoever's behind it knows him. Knows what buttons to push." "Did Mr. Sloane mention past adversaries?" Not directly. Claimed he didn't have any. But there's something he's not telling us. You can smell it. Wolfe nodded once, as if he'd expected no less. Good. You will pursue his background, I groaned. You want me to dig through his laundry? I want you, Wolfe said, to determine what skeleton lies in Mr. Sloane's closet, the one rattling loud enough to be heard through mirrors. I knew better than to argue. Wolfe didn't chase shadows unless he believed they threw a tangible shape. If he thought there was a flesh-and-blood threat behind Sloane's nightmares, then somewhere behind the fear was a very real hand pushing the mirror out of place. I started that afternoon with the easy stuff. City directories, property records, public documents. Sloane hadn't lied about living alone. He'd been in that Murray Hill apartment for 7 years, paying rent on time, no criminal record, no lawsuits filed either by or against him. The man was a cipher. But when I called in a few favours from an old friend downtown, things got more interesting. Gilbert Sloane wasn't always a name you could lose in a crowd. 10 years ago, under a slightly different haircut and a less jittery smile, he had been an executive vice president at Blaine & Costa, one of the biggest advertising firms in the city. A golden boy, sharp, ambitious, respected, and then, suddenly, gone. No formal charges, no lawsuits, just vanished. One day he was presenting multi-million-dollar accounts, and the next he was a ghost, living in a crumbling brownstone surrounded by mirrors. I leaned back in my chair, tapping my pen against my notebook. Somewhere, between the boardrooms and the brownstone, Sloane had made an enemy. A bad one, the kind who didn't forget, the kind who didn't forgive, the kind who could stand behind you without ever needing to touch you, and still leave you terrified of your own reflection. He grabbed the phone and dialed Sloane's number. It rang 6 times before he answered, breathless. "Mr. Sloane," I said, "we need to talk about your past." There was a long silence on the line. Then, very softly, "They're coming," he whispered. "I saw them again. In the mirror." The line went dead. I hung up slowly, a cold knot tightening in my gut. I turned to Wolfe, who had been watching me, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Goodwin," he said calmly, "fetch your coat." I didn't need to ask why, because something had finally cracked the mirror, and whatever was coming through wasn't waiting anymore. Chapter 4. Shattered Illusions. The rain had eased up by the time we reached Sloane's building, leaving the streets slick and steaming. Wolfe stayed in the car, of course. Getting him out into the open air twice in one day would have been a medical miracle. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, hand on the butt of my gun inside my coat. Sloane's door was ajar, not wide open, just cracked, like an invitation written by someone who didn't care whether you came in or not. I pushed it open with my foot and stepped inside. The apartment was dead silent. No Sloane pacing by the window, no nervous muttering, no mirror clutched in white-knuckled hands, just the soft ticking of a clock somewhere, and the faint smell of something bitter, like burnt paper. The living room looked mostly untouched, except for one thing. The mirrors. Every mirror in the place. The big one over the fireplace, the small ones hanging by the door. The dresser mirror Sloane had clutched like a lifeline, were shattered, not smashed to bits, but cracked. fine, intricate spider webs radiating from invisible points of impact, like some invisible hand had touched each one lightly, and the glass had recoiled in terror. I stepped carefully over a few slivers on the floor and made my way to the bedroom. That's where I found him. Sloane sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, arms limp at his sides. His face was pale, blank, as if the last spark of fight had drained right out of him. I crouched in front of him and snapped my fingers once, sharply. Nothing. No flicker of recognition, no blink. It took me a few seconds to realize what was in his lap. Another mirror, unbroken, the only one left, and written across the surface in red lipstick, or something that looked an awful lot like it, were two words: admit it. I straightened slowly, my mind ticking like a time bomb. This wasn't random. This wasn't just about fear anymore. Someone wanted Sloane broken, yes, but they also wanted something out of him. A confession, and judging by the glass graveyard scattered around the apartment, they were getting closer to squeezing it out of him. I pulled out my notebook and took stock, methodically. No sign of forced entry again, no missing valuables, no physical harm done to Sloane. At least not yet. Message, clearly intended for him to see immediately. It was a psychological attack, precise and escalating, and it was working. I called Wolfe from the phone in the kitchen, keeping my voice low, even though Sloane didn't seem capable of hearing anything at the moment. "He's alive," I said. "But he's in bad shape. Somebody came through here and cracked every mirror except the one he was holding. Left a message. Admit it." Wolfe's voice on the other end was calm, but tight. "Return immediately," he said. "Bring Mr. Sloane if possible." "And if he's too far gone to move?" There was a pause. "Then bring the mirror," Wolfe said. It wasn't a suggestion. I pocketed the small mirror carefully, wrapping it in my handkerchief, then hauled Sloane to his feet. He didn't resist, didn't even seem to notice. I slung his arm over my shoulder, and half carried, half dragged him down the stairs and into the waiting car. Wolfe said nothing as Fritz helped me wrestle Sloane into the back seat. He simply sat back and closed his eyes, lips pressed into a grim line. The drive back was quiet except for the low hum of the tires on wet pavement. By the time we reached the brownstone, the mirror in my pocket felt heavier than a brick, and whatever truth Sloane had buried deep inside himself, whatever secret someone thought was worth scaring him to death over, it was coming closer, closer than either of us liked. And if we didn't dig it out soon, it wasn't just the mirrors that were going to shatter. Chapter 5. Smoke behind the glass back. At the brownstone, Fritz ushered Sloane into the guest room, with the same delicate care he used for half-dead orchids. Wolfe ordered coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and sat himself behind his desk, like a judge about to preside over a particularly irritating case. I placed the mirror, still wrapped in my handkerchief, carefully on Wolfe's desk. He didn't touch it. He just stared at it, the way he stared at crime scenes, annoyed that human stupidity kept making messes he had to clean up. "Describe the apartment again," he said. I ran through it. The cracked mirrors, the undisturbed furniture, the smell of burnt paper, the absence of forced entry. And Mr. Sloane's state? Practically catatonic, I said. Whatever scared him this time nearly did the full job. Wolfe grunted, a deep, unhappy sound. He will not be useful unless we revive him. I nodded. Working on it. Fritz is brewing enough caffeine to launch a rocket. Wolfe finally, gingerly, unwrapped the mirror. The words were still there, smeared slightly now. Admit it. He studied it for a long minute, then looked up. Mr. Goodwin, you will return to Mr. Sloane's former life. His advertising firm? Blaine and Costa, Wolfe said. You will determine why Mr. Sloane left. Who might have cause to seek a confession. And if they don't want to talk, he smiled thinly, persuade them. I grinned. That was one of the few areas where Wolfe didn't mind my creative interpretation of orders. While Fritz kept Sloane corralled in the guest room with coffee and gentle words, I changed into a dry suit, grabbed my hat, and headed out into the city. Again, Blaine and Costa occupied an entire floor of a gleaming steel tower near Bryant Park. Polished, expensive, and exactly as soulless as you'd expect from an ad agency pulling 6 figures to make toothpaste seem romantic. At the reception desk, a woman with crimson lipstick and a perm sharp enough to cut glass gave me a once-over that suggested she didn't think much of my tailoring. May I help you? Yeah, I said easily, flipping open my ID. Archie Goodwin, investigating an old employee, Gilbert Sloane. Her expression didn't flicker, but her eyes cooled 2 degrees. 1 moment, please. She buzzed someone, murmured a few words, and after a short pause, a tall man in a tailored navy suit appeared. He was built like a scarecrow, dressed by Brooks Brothers, and carried himself like he thought Manhattan should thank him for letting it exist. Roger Pell, he said, offering a hand without warmth. Head of HR, what can we do for you? I shook the hand, noting the dry, practiced grip. Gilbert Sloane, I said, used to work here. Left suddenly about 10 years ago. Pell's mouth thinned. That name doesn't come up often anymore. But you remember? He hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Sloane was brilliant, one of our best creatives, but unstable. Unstable how? He became erratic, Pell said carefully, paranoid, accused senior partners of unethical behavior, eavesdropping, spying, sabotage. And were they? Pell smiled thinly. I wouldn't know. In advertising, Mr. Goodwin, paranoia and ambition are often indistinguishable. And he left voluntarily. Under pressure, Pell admitted. There was no lawsuit, no police involvement, just an understanding. I tucked my hands into my pockets. What kind of understanding? Pell's smile sharpened. He signed a non-disclosure agreement. Standard procedure. In exchange, we agreed not to pursue a psychiatric commitment order. My eyebrows lifted. He was that bad. He was becoming a liability, Pell said smoothly. And liabilities are trimmed. I let that sink in. Trimmed, like a mirror cracked carefully, precisely, to make sure it shattered in all the right places. Who handled the trimming? I asked. Pell's eyes didn't flicker. That would have been Mr. Costa himself, George Costa. I nodded. Still around? Retired, Pell said. Lives upstate, but he occasionally consults. I thanked him and left, stomach sour. Sloane hadn't just burned out. He'd been shoved out, cornered into signing his silence away, and discarded like yesterday's press release. And now A decade later, someone wanted him to admit something. Something he'd seen, or something he'd done. I didn't know which yet, but I knew one thing for sure. The man who feared the mirror wasn't crazy. He was guilty of something, and whoever was behind the glass wasn't going to let him forget it. Chapter 6. Reflections of Guilt. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, not in his chair, but standing at the office window, hands clasped behind his back. That alone told me he was restless. A rare enough event that if we'd had tourists passing through, I'd have charged admission. I dumped my hat and coat and gave him the rundown. Blaine and Costa, Roger Pell, the sudden understanding that ushered Gilbert Sloane out the door without lawsuits or headlines, and the name of George Costa, the firm's co-founder and hatchet man. Wolfe grunted. They suppressed a scandal, he said. Standard practice. Yeah, I said, but what scandal? He turned from the window, settling back into his chair with a grunt of effort. Mr. Sloane's terror is not born from the fear of discovery alone, Wolfe said. It is born of memory. He tapped a finger against the arm of his chair. Someone is forcing him to relive whatever drove him to paranoia 10 years ago. I nodded. And they're escalating. Indeed, Wolfe said. To what end? Maybe to destroy him. Maybe use him. He steepled his fingers. Mr. Goodwin, he said, you will find Mr. George Costa. And if he's not feeling chatty. Wolfe's smile was thin and wolfish. Apply persuasion. I saluted lazily and headed out again, cursing the cold and the stubborn way New York clings to its secrets like a drowning man to a suitcase full of bricks. It took some digging, but I finally found Costa listed in a sleepy little town about 90 minutes north of the city. A whitewashed farmhouse, private lane, the whole retired, magnate hiding from the world set up. I rented a car and made the drive, arriving just as a dull grey sunset was bleeding out behind the hills. Costa answered the door himself. He was a big man, though the years had shrunk and shagged him some. His hair was white, his jaw still square, and his eyes were sharp enough to shave with. Yeah, he barked. Archie Goodwin, I said. Private investigator. I'm looking into a matter involving one of your former employees, Gilbert Sloane. At the mention of Sloane's name, Costa's mouth tightened into a thin, bloodless line. Don't know him. Sure you do, I said easily. Blaine and Costa, creative department, around 10 years back. He hesitated just a little too long. I handled thousands of employees, he said finally. Names blur. I leaned against the doorframe. Funny thing, I said. Most of them don't end up barricading themselves in apartments full of mirrors, scared of their own reflections. Costa's jaw flexed. Not my problem. Maybe not, I said. But if Sloane cracks and he's close, you might find yourself explaining things to the police instead of me. That got his attention. He studied me for a long moment, weighing options. Then he stepped back and jerked his head. Come in. Inside, the house was warm and smelled of old books and pipe tobacco. Costa led me into a den lined with heavy wooden shelves and poured himself a drink without offering me one. You want the truth? He said. Fine. He dropped into a leather armchair, cradling his glass. Sloane was a rising star. Too good for his own good. Smart enough to spot things he wasn't supposed to. Like what? Bribery, kickbacks, illegal ad buys, stuff that would have sunk half our client list if it ever got out. He sipped his drink. We couldn't fire him without a fuss. He was too well liked. So we isolated him, spread a few rumours, let him talk himself into a hole. By the time he left, he was convinced everyone was watching him. I whistled low. Professional gaslighting, I said. Call it what you want, Costa said. It worked. Until now, I said. He shrugged. The past has a way of clawing back. I stood. One more thing, I said. Anybody else Sloane might have tangled with back then? Someone with a personal grudge? Costa thought for a second. Yeah, he said finally. Douglas Clayman. He was head of finance, took most of the heat when Sloane started sniffing. Didn't end well for him. Where's Clayman now? Last I heard. Costa smiled humorlessly. Dead. Suicide. About 8 years ago. I nodded once and left him there, staring into his drink. Driving back to the city, the pieces rattled around in my head. Sloane had been silenced. His sanity was cracked by people who were supposed to have been on his side, but now someone was pulling at those cracks, making them wider, and the name Douglas Clayman hovered like a ghost at the edge of the mirror. Dead or not, his shadow hadn't gone away. If we didn't move fast, Gilbert Sloane wouldn't just be fearing his reflection anymore. He'd be joining it, for good. Chapter 7. Whispers on Glass. When I rolled back up to the brownstone, the city had sunk into the kind of fog you could lose a horse in. Street lamps threw halos into the mist, and the sidewalks looked slick enough to break a dozen ankles between. 35th and Madison alone. Inside, Wolfe was where I left him, behind his desk, scowling at a copy of Orchid Digest like it had personally insulted his ancestors. Fritz ghosted me with a tray, laying out coffee and sandwiches for me without a word. Good man. I tossed my coat over the rack and filled Wolfe in. George Costa's confession, Sloane's manufactured paranoia, the quiet, uncomfortable detail about Douglas Clayman's convenient death. Wolfe listened without interrupting, his eyes hooded, fingertips pressed together under his chin. When I finished, he sighed. So, he said, the past is not merely haunting Mr. Sloane. It is being weaponized. Looks that way, I agreed. Only problem is, Clayman's dead. Officially, anyway. Suicide? Wolfe asked. That's the story, I said. Costa didn't seem broken up about it. Wolfe drummed his fingers lightly on the arm of his chair. Suicide is convenient, he murmured, especially when it silences potential scandal. I nodded. And it leaves Sloane alone with the ghosts. Wolfe grunted. Not alone enough, apparently. We sat in silence for a moment, the office heavy with the weight of unspoken possibilities. Then the phone rang. I snagged it before Fritz could. Yeah? There was a long, breathy pause on the line. Then a voice, hoarse, ragged, whispered 2 words. Help me. Sloane? I snapped. No answer. Just a low rustling, like fingers scrabbling against a phone mouthpiece. Sloane! I barked. A click. Then silence. I hung up slowly, feeling the tight coil of tension ratchet higher in my gut. Wolfe's gaze pinned me from across the room. Mr. Sloane? Yeah, I said. Or someone trying real hard to sound like him. Wolfe stood, actually stood, and moved to the windows, peering out into the mist-cloaked street. "The mirror," he said thoughtfully. "The last intact one. Where is it?" "Your desk," I said, "wrapped and tucked away. Fetch it." I crossed the room and pulled out the package. Wolfe unwrapped it with careful fingers and set the mirror on his blotter, tilting it so it caught the muted glow of the desk lamp. The surface looked clean, ordinary, except it wasn't, because now, traced faintly into the lower corner, so faint you'd miss it if you weren't looking, were 3 initials D.K. Douglas Clayman. I exhaled slowly. "Either somebody's trying real hard to scare Sloane to death," I said, "or Clayman's ghost just RSVP'd. Wolfe didn't smile. "There is no ghost," he said flatly, "only a mind determined to resurrect the dead, and use Sloane to finish whatever score they think is still unsettled," I added. He nodded once. "We must act," Wolfe said, "tonight." "Are you expecting trouble?" "I expect," Wolfe said grimly, "that Mr. Sloane's past and ours will converge before dawn." He turned toward me, his eyes sharper than the cold bite of the fog outside. "You will bring Mr. Sloane here, now." I grabbed my coat, already moving. Outside, the city's heartbeat pulsed low and slow under the mist. The mirrors had cracked. The truth was leaking through. And if we weren't careful, the man who feared the mirror would be facing far worse than his own reflection. He'd be facing his judgment, and so would we. Chapter 8. Through the Glass, Darkly. The trip back to Sloane's building was fast, wet, and ugly. Fog clung to the sidewalks like a second skin, muffling the sound of my steps as I jogged up the stoop and hammered on the door. No answer. I knocked. Again, harder. Still nothing. A bad feeling twisted in my gut. I drew my gun, not standard procedure for a guy whose biggest danger is usually paper cuts, and nudged the door open. Inside, the apartment was worse than before. The air was heavy, damp with a sickly sweetness I didn't want to place. More. Mirrors were broken now, every shard catching the low light and scattering it around the room in jagged slices. And Sloane was gone. The place wasn't just empty. It had been abandoned in a hurry. A cup of cold coffee sat half-spilled on the table. Papers from a manila envelope littered the floor, their edges curling from the damp. I moved carefully, sweeping the living room, the bedroom, the tiny kitchen. No sign of a struggle. No blood, but something was off. On the dresser where Sloane had last clutched the mirror, a new message was scrawled across the cracked glass in that same smeared, greasy hand. "Meet me where it started." I didn't need Wolfe to tell me what that meant. Blaine and Costa, the firm, the birthplace of Sloane's nightmare, and maybe the place it was finally supposed to end. I backed out carefully, locking the door behind me, and called the brownstone. Fritz answered. "Get Wolfe," I said, "and tell him to cancel tonight's orchid session. We've got a rendezvous with a ghost." In the cab ride over, the fog thickened. New York looked less like a city and more like a half-forgotten memory. Street lights blurred. Horns sounded distant, like voices shouting from underwater. I arrived at Blaine and Costa just after 9. The building was dark, except for a faint glow in one of the upper floors. Probably the cleaning crew, or something pretending to be. Its main entrance was locked, but a side door hung ajar. I slipped inside, moving quietly. The marble lobby stretched out in front of me like the beginning of a bad dream. Too clean, too quiet. The overhead lights flickering, as if the building itself had second thoughts about what was coming. Upstairs, on the 3rd floor, I found Sloane. He stood alone in the centre of the main conference room, staring at the long mirror mounted on the far wall. His reflection stared back at him, distorted by the curve of the glass, like a funhouse version of himself, Mr. Sloane. I said softly. He didn't move. I stepped closer, careful not to spook him. "What are you doing here?" His voice, when it came, was low and hollow. Finishing it. I moved around to face him, and that's when I saw it. In the mirror, behind him, another figure, not mine, not his, a man, shorter than Sloane, heavier around the middle, wearing a dark overcoat and a hat pulled low. Watching, I spun around. Empty room. No one there, only in the glass, only in the place Sloane feared most. He shivered visibly. "I tried to forget," he whispered. "Tried to bury it." "Bury what?" Sloane's hands shook as he pointed at the reflection. "Clayman!" he breathed. "I saw it. The night they pushed him. The night they made it look like suicide." My throat tightened. "You witnessed it?" He nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. "They made me sign papers, promised me they'd ruin me if I said anything. He shook his head wildly. "I thought it would go away. It never does. Not in this town." I took a slow step toward him. "Come on, Mr. Sloane, let's go. We'll talk to Wolfe. We'll fix this." But before I could reach him, the lights flickered, and the door behind me slammed shut. The figure in the mirror smiled, in the glass only. Sloane screamed, a raw, broken sound, and collapsed to his knees. I turned, gun raised, heart hammering. The conference room was still empty, silent, except for the low, mocking creak of the mirror warping against the wall. Pulled Sloane to his feet, half dragged, half carried him down the stairs and out into the misty street, flagging the first cab I could find. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, a fresh beer in one hand, a stack of case notes in the other. Dropped Sloane into a chair, breathing hard. "He's ready to talk," I said. "All of it." Wolfe inclined his head. "Good," he said softly. His eyes flicked once to the mirror I carried, small, cracked, but still whole enough to reflect a man's fear. "Because the true face," Wolfe murmured, "is never what we see in the glass." He tapped the papers before him. "Is what we choose to hide behind it, and the time for hiding was almost over." Chapter 9. Splinters of the past Sloane sat slumped in the red leather chair like a puppet with the strings cut, staring at nothing. Fritz appeared with coffee strong enough to power a steamship and a dry towel, which Sloane clutched without seeming to notice. Wolfe let the silence stretch, giving him time to anchor whatever loose bolts were still rattling inside his head. I perched on the edge of the couch, my notepad ready, but my pen still capped. No point rushing a man whose soul had just been dragged through a haunted house version of his own memory. Finally, Sloane spoke, slow, halting, but clear. "It wasn't just Clayman," he said, voice rough with disuse and fear. "It was all of them. Costa, Pell, 2 or 3 others. They cooked the books for years. Slush funds, bribery, illegal contracts. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. I found out by accident. Wrong file, wrong drawer. They knew I had it. And instead of confronting you, Wolfe prompted gently. They started watching me, Sloane said, or made me think they were. At first it was little things. Doors left open, papers moved, mirrors. His voice hitched. Always the mirrors. I'd catch glimpses of them, reflections where no one should have been. A calculated effort to destabilize you, Wolfe said grimly. Erode your credibility. Sloane nodded. It worked, he said bitterly. By the time they offered me the deal, I was half crazy already. I signed whatever they put in front of me just to make it stop. And Clayman? I asked. Sloane's hands clenched, the towel tighter. He was going to talk. He couldn't live with it. The night he died, he shuddered. I was there, not inside, but across the street. I was meeting him. He'd asked me to. Said he was ready to blow the whole thing open. He swallowed hard. I saw 2 men go into his apartment. Minutes later, he fell. From his own balcony. Wolfe leaned forward, slightly, the weight of his attention settling like an invisible hand on Sloane's shoulder. You witnessed a murder, Wolfe said, and let them convince you it was your imagination. Sloane covered his face with both hands. I tried to forget, he whispered. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I disappeared, they'd leave me alone. But someone, Wolfe said, wanted you to remember. Sloane nodded miserably. I don't know who, he said. I don't. I exchanged a glance with Wolfe. He gave a minute nod. Mr. Goodwin, he said, call Mr. Roger Pell. I raised an eyebrow. You think he's behind the curtain? I think, Wolfe said, that Mr. Pell's position at Blaine and Costa depends on secrets staying buried, and he had the most to lose when Mr. Sloane's memories began to surface. I picked up the phone and dialed. Pell answered on the 3rd ring, his voice crisp and polished even at this hour. This is Pell. Goodwin, I said. We need to meet. Tonight. A pause. I'm afraid that's impossible, Pell said smoothly. I'm very busy. You'll make time, I said. Unless you want to explain to the police why your firm's buried skeletons are dancing a jig in Sloane's mirrors. Another pause. Longer this time. Very well, Pell said. Where? Wolfe scribbled an address on a pad and slid it across the desk to me. Here, I said, reading it off. 30 minutes. Pell hung up without a goodbye. I set the phone down and looked at Wolfe. Are you expecting fireworks? He gave me a tight, satisfied smile. Not fireworks, Mr. Goodwin, he said. An admission. He stood, moving heavily toward the bookshelves where the 3 cracked mirrors still rested under their clothes, hidden but not forgotten. When faced with the inevitability of exposure, Wolfe said softly, even the most practiced deceiver will choose confession, if only to control the terms. I nodded grimly. Outside, the city seemed to lean against the windows, heavy and breathless, waiting. 30 minutes, one last reflection, one last chance to shatter the lies that had haunted Gilbert Sloane for a decade. And this time, the mirror would break both ways. Chapter 10. The man behind the glass Roger Pell arrived precisely on time. his shoes glistening from the wet streets, his suit pressed sharp enough to slice bread. He walked into the brownstone like a man attending a tedious board meeting, not a man one step away from the wrong side of a courtroom. Fritz showed him into the office without ceremony. Wolfe was already settled behind his desk, a pitcher of beer within arm's reach. I stood by the door, arms folded, making it clear there were no easy exits tonight. Sloane sat hunched in the red chair, eyes glassy, but alert enough to recognize Pell. His shoulders tensed like someone had dropped an ice cube down his spine. Pell's gaze flicked over him and settled on Wolfe. "You said you had information relevant to my firm's interests," Pell said smoothly. "Not your firm's," Wolfe corrected, voice soft and deadly. "Your own." Pell's mouth twitched just a little. "I see." Wolfe leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Mr. Sloane has remembered," he said, "fully." Pell's gaze didn't waver, but I saw the slight clench of his jaw. "Remembered what?" he asked. "The night Douglas Clayman died," Wolfe said. "The night Mr. Sloane was supposed to meet him. The night 2 men entered his apartment and arranged a convenient suicide." Pell shook his head, a small rehearsed movement. "Have no proof of such a thing." "No," Wolfe agreed. "But we have Mr. Sloane's testimony, and shortly we shall have more." Pell's hands flexed at his sides, as if weighing the wisdom of turning and running versus staying and bluffing. "You can't possibly expect anyone to believe the ravings of a man in Mr. Sloane's condition." "He is remarkably lucid now," Wolfe said. "Fear has a clarifying effect." Pell's lips thinned. "I wasn't involved," he said quickly. "I wasn't even there." "Yet," Wolfe said, "it was you who suggested isolating Mr. Sloane. You who spread rumours of instability. You who managed the final non-disclosure agreements." Pell said nothing. "Mr. Costa," Wolfe continued, "may have wielded the blade, but you sharpened it." Still no reply. I moved closer, letting my footsteps sound heavy against the floorboards. "You've been pushing Sloane," I said, "sending the tulips, moving the mirrors, setting up the notes, trying to break him before he remembered enough to point. The finger." Pell's head snapped toward me. "Ridiculous, is it?" Wolfe said lazily. "Or are you merely following the pattern established years ago, whispering shadows into his mind until he cracks?" Pell opened his mouth, shut it again. Wolfe gave him a long, cool stare. "You know what happened to Clayman," Wolfe said softly. "You know who was involved. And now, Mr. Pell, your choices are limited." Pell's eyes darted toward the door, toward Sloane, back to Wolfe. "If you remain silent," Wolfe said, "you will be implicated fully when Mr. Sloane's sworn statement is delivered to the district attorney in the morning. And if I talk," Pell rasped. "You may yet control the damage," Wolfe said. "A familiar exercise, I believe." For a moment, the only sound was the steady drip of rain outside the windows. Then Pell sagged, the air leaking out of him like a punctured tire. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he muttered. "We just wanted to scare him off, make him quit. Clayman panicked, said he was going to the press. He was unstable. They said if we didn't handle it, we'd all go down. Define, handle it," Wolfe said coldly. Pell swallowed. Costa and 2 others confronted him. It got physical. He slipped. "Slipped," I repeated, my voice dry as sandpaper. He fell, Pell insisted. "I swear it. But afterward, they made it look deliberate, cleaned it up, set the story." "And you?" Wolfe asked. "I kept the machinery running," Pell said bitterly. "Made sure Sloane stayed quiet. Made sure no questions were asked." "And lately?" Wolfe pressed. Pell wiped a shaking hand across his mouth. "I knew Sloane was cracking again. I thought, better to push him over completely than let him piece it together." He looked at Sloane, something flickering in his face. Pity, maybe, or just fear. "But it didn't work," he finished hollowly. "No," Wolfe said, "it did not." He pressed a button on his desk. Kramer and two of his men stepped into the room almost immediately. Fritz must have let them in quietly, while Pell was busy signing his own confession in the air. Pell didn't resist. He just let himself be led away, shoulders slumped, shoes silent against the floorboards. When the door shut behind him, the brownstone seemed to exhale. Sloane sagged back into the chair, the last of his terror draining away like water from a cracked basin. "You're safe now," Wolfe said quietly. "No more mirrors." Sloane closed his eyes. For once, no reflection smiled back at him. Only the truth, ugly, unearthed, and final. Wolfe reached for his beer. Outside the rain had stopped, and somewhere in the dark city, a new day was waiting to break. Chapter 11. The Last Crack. The morning after Pell's confession, New York woke up in its usual indifferent sprawl, cabs honking, paperboys shouting, steam hissing from grates. Life moved on. It always does, no matter who crumbles underneath it. Inside the brownstone, things were quieter. Sloane was still upstairs, sleeping off the kind of exhaustion you don't recover from with just 8 hours and a good breakfast. Fritz checked on him every hour, like a nurse assigned to a shell-shocked soldier. Wolfe, meanwhile, was back too, his orchids grunting occasionally when a bloom displeased him. I sat in the office, flipping through the first editions of the morning papers. Buried 3 pages deep in the Gazette was a neat little blurb. Ad executive under investigation for decade-old financial scandal. No names, no real damage. Not yet. But Wolfe had already sent Sloane's sworn statement and my own report to Inspector Kramer, along with copies to 2 newspapers under strict instructions. If anything suspicious happened to Sloane, the full story would go public within hours. Insurance, the kind you need when ghosts have friends in expensive suits. 9:30, Wolfe summoned me with a grunt. "Report," he said, not looking up from his trowel. I stood, stretching the stiffness out of my back. Pell's in custody. Kramer says he's squawking like a parrot. Already named Costa and 2 others. The DA's office is sharpening knives. "Good," Wolfe said simply. "And Sloane." Wolfe set the trowel down carefully and wiped his hands on a linen cloth. "Mr. Sloane," he said, "has a choice." I raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "To continue living in fear," Wolfe said, "or to reclaim his life." I didn't envy the man. After a decade of looking over his shoulder, freedom might feel like another kind of prison. But at least it would be his choice now. Wolfe shifted his bulk back into his desk chair and poured himself a glass of beer. "You did well, Archie," he said. I smirked. Praise from Wolfe is rarer than a New York cabbie using a turn signal. "Don't get all sentimental on me," I said. "It'll ruin your reputation." He grunted again, which in his language meant, "I heard you, and I'm choosing to ignore you." I headed for the front door to clear my head with some city air. On the way out, I passed the little mirror Sloane had left behind. It sat on the hall table, its surface cracked but still catching the light. I paused for a second, looking into it. No strange figures, no whispered accusations, just me. Tired, a little older, but still here. I tapped the glass with one finger. "Better luck next time," I muttered. Outside, the city spread out in its chaotic, endless rhythm. Cabs swerved, vendors shouted, the world spun on, indifferent to a cracked mirror, or a ruined man, or a truth 10 years too late. I slipped my hands into my pockets and grinned. Another case closed, another ghost laid to rest, at least until the next one came knocking. Because, in New York, there's always another shadow waiting. Always another reflection you don't quite trust. And me? I'd be ready. Mirrors or no mirrors. Ghosts or no ghosts. Because in this town, the only thing more dangerous than facing the truth is running from it. Chapter 12. No Reflections. After dark 2 days later, Sloane left the brownstone. Not through the front door, not with any fanfare. Just a quiet slip into a waiting cab, a battered suitcase at his feet, his collar turned up against the wind. Fritz gave him a thermos of coffee for the road. I gave him a nod. Wolfe didn't come down to see him off, but that wasn't personal. It was policy. Wolfe's interest in clients ended when the case did, like a man snapping a book shut after. The last page. Sloane didn't say goodbye. He just climbed into the cab and disappeared into the city he used to belong to. And maybe, if he was lucky, could belong to again. Inside, Wolfe resumed his usual rhythms like nothing had happened. Breakfast at 9, orchids until 11, lunch precisely at 1. The routine was his fortress. His refusal to let human messiness smudge the clean lines of his world. For my part, I didn't mind the quiet. Cases like Sloane's had a way of sticking to you longer than the headlines did. You walk through a few too many cracked mirrors, and you start wondering how solid your own reflection really is. That afternoon, I was in the office, pretending to organize case files while actually contemplating a nap, when Wolfe spoke without, looking up from his book. "Mr. Goodwin, yeah, boss? Order another mirror for the hall." I blinked. "Are you serious?" "The crack offends me," Wolfe said, as if discussing a stained necktie. I almost laughed but caught myself. In Wolfe's world, appearances mattered, reflections mattered. Cracks once exposed had to be erased. "Sure," I said, scribbling a fake note on my pad. "New mirror is coming up." He grunted approval and turned a page with the sound of finality. Leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Sloane had faced his reflection, the real one, and survived. Not unscarred, maybe not whole, but alive. That counted for something, and the men who had twisted him, used him, broken him, they were finally getting their due. Justice wasn't always fast in New York. It wasn't always flashy. But when it landed hard. Another case closed, another ghost laid to rest, another mirror wiped clean, at least until the next crack appeared, because it always did, especially in a city where the past never stays buried, where every reflection hides something you're not ready to see. I smiled to myself. grabbed my hat, and headed out into the late afternoon bustle. New York kept moving, noisy and reckless, a city of broken reflections stitched together by pure stubbornness. And me, I was right there with it, because no matter how many mirrors you cracked, you still had to face whatever stared back. And around here, you'd better be ready, or the next time you looked, you just might not see yourself at all.